At the narrow pass where mountains press against the sea, where sulfur springs rise from the earth, men once stood against an empire. Thermopylae, the hot gates, a place where the air itself seemed to breathe fire, became the stage for one of history's most haunting tales. They say 300 Spartans faced the armies of Persia, though in truth they were not alone. Allies stood beside them. Yet it is the Spartans who linger in memory, their shields locked, their voices steady, their fate sealed. Against them surged the vast host of Xerxes, so many men that ancient storytellers swore they drank rivers dry and darkened the sun with arrows. In that narrow space, flesh and bronze met in rhythm, the beat of shields, the clash of spears, the cries of men pressed into legend. It was not simply a battle. It was a moment where courage and inevitability met, where death itself was embraced as an offering to the idea of freedom. Thermopylae endures not because of victory, but because of defiance. A lullaby of iron and blood, a story trumpeted across centuries, reminding us that even in the shadow of doom, men may choose to stand. Men may choose death over tyranny. The story of Thermopylae begins not with Spartans sharpening their spears, but with the rumble of an empire stirring to march. Across the Aegean Sea, in the heart of Persia, a king prepared to sweep westward with a force so vast that even his own subjects told how it could not be counted. This was Xerxes, son of Darius, ruler of the largest empire the world had yet known, a monarch whose word could command millions and whose ambition stretched farther than the horizon. His father, Darius, had already tasted humiliation at the hands of the Greeks. At Marathon, a Persian army had been flung back by men who fought not for empire, but for their fragile independence. The sting of that loss lingered, a thorn in the Persian crown. Xerxes inherited more than his father's empire. He inherited the thirst for revenge. Greece, a jagged scatter of city-states on the western edge of the known world, had defied the great king once. Now they would be made to bow, or they would burn. So the preparations began. From the Nile Valley to the plains of Mesopotamia, from the mountains of Persia to the coast of Anatolia, soldiers were summoned. Herodotus, the great chronicler of the ancient world, claimed the numbers reached into the millions. He may have exaggerated, as he often did, but there is no doubt the army was immense, drawn from every corner of the empire. Medes and Persians in flowing robes, Assyrians with pointed helmets, Indians carrying bows as tall as a man, Ethiopians with faces painted half white and half red, Scythians with their carved swords. It was less an army than a moving continent, a living tapestry of peoples pressed into the service of one king who believed himself a god. Alongside them rolled the machinery of empire, horses by the tens of thousands, wagons laden with supplies, siege engines creaking on wooden wheels. Behind them came the endless train of servants, cooks, water carriers, and slaves, each one vital to keeping the vast machine moving. The Persians did not march quietly. They shook the earth with every step, leaving behind empty storehouses, drained rivers, fields stripped bare by their appetites. Herodotus, again with his taste for grandeur, swore that when they drank, whole rivers vanished. Get rid of that last from Herodotus, because you said that already. So that'll go. At the head of this procession rode Xerxes, draped in the robes of kingship, his chariot gleaming. He was the embodiment of Persian might. To his subjects, he was the earthly shadow of the divine. His gaze was law, his anger, both judge and executioner. Yet, he was not content merely to march into Greece. He wished to display the inevitability of Persia's triumph. He ordered a bridge of boats to be built across the Hellespont, a floating highway that would carry his army across the narrow strait separating Asia from Europe. When storms tore it apart, Xerxes lashed the waters with chains, as if punishing the sea itself for daring to resist him. Then he ordered it rebuilt, stronger, wider, more magnificent, and across it his army marched, their feet drumming the beginning of Greece's darkest hour. For the Greeks, news of this advancing tide spread like thunder. Scouts and traders brought stories of endless ranks of soldiers, of ships covering the sea like locusts. To small, fractious city-states accustomed to squabbling over borders, the thought of facing such a force seemed almost laughable. Many cities submitted before the Persians even arrived, sending tokens of earth and water to symbolize their obedience. Others hesitated, calculating whether it was better to bend the knee than to fight and be destroyed. But not all. In Athens, memories of Marathon burned bright, a reminder that Persia was not invincible. In Sparta, where boys were trained from childhood to endure pain and never retreat, the very scale of the threat only sharpened their resolve. For men raised to believe that death in battle was the highest honor, the coming storm was not merely danger, but destiny. Still, even the bravest among them could not ignore the sheer weight of Persia's might. Imagine being a Greek farmer, standing in your olive grove, hearing tales of an army so vast it could not be counted. Imagine knowing that your city, with its walls and its hoplites, would stand alone against a tide drawn from half the world. The fear was not abstract. It was a shadow on the land, an awareness that soon, from the passes of the north to the shores of the south, all of Greece would hear the drumbeat of Persia's advance. It was in this climate of dread and defiance that Thermopylae entered the story. The Greeks knew they could not defeat Persia in open battle. Not yet, anyway. They needed time. They needed to hold the passes, to choke the vast army in narrow places where numbers would mean less. And so eyes turned to Thermopylae, the hot gates, where mountains pressed against the sea, and the way was so narrow that a handful of men could bar the path of thousands. Xerxes, with his armies like a tide, believed nothing could stop him. But Greece, trembling yet unbroken, was about to show him that the measure of a people is not counted in numbers alone. News of Xerxes' advance spread through Greece like a cold wind. Traders, scouts, and trembling envoys carried stories of rivers drained and villages trampled underfoot. The Persians were not a rumor anymore, but a rolling storm, and the city-states of Greece, so accustomed to quarreling amongst themselves, faced a choice they had rarely made: unite or perish. Greece was no kingdom. It was a patchwork of fiercely independent city-states, each jealous of its freedom, each suspicious of its neighbors. Athens prided itself on democracy, a place where citizens argued in the marketplace and boasted of their victory at Marathon. Sparta, in the south, was their opposite in almost every way, a land of iron discipline, where boys were taken from their mothers at 7 and trained in the agoge to become warriors who feared nothing, not even death. Thebes and Corinth, Argos and Delphi, each city carried its own pride, its own grudges. For centuries they had fought each other almost as often as they had fought outsiders. But Xerxes' army was something different. No local quarrel could blind them to the sight of an empire so vast it stretched from India to Egypt, an empire determined to make Greece its frontier province. The Athenians knew their fleet would be crucial. The Spartans knew their warriors were unmatched in the phalanx. Slowly, reluctantly, the great rivals reached for one another's hands. Out of desperation was born the Hellenic League, a fragile alliance of city-states who promised, for once, to fight side by side. Where to make their grand stand became the next question. The Persians could march through northern Greece, but the mountains offered narrow passes where their numbers would count for little. Thermopylae was the most promising, a cleft between cliff and sea where no more than a few hundred men could fight abreast. If the pass could be held, then Athenians and the fleet could strike at sea, perhaps evening the odds. The Spartans were chosen to lead the defense. Their reputation was legendary, their discipline unshakable. At their head was King Leonidas, one of Sparta's 2 kings, a man already past his youth, but hardened by a lifetime of Spartan rigor. Before Leonidas marched to Thermopylae, before shields were raised and spears leveled against the tide of Persia, he had to face powers more mysterious than armies. In Sparta, war was not waged at the whim of kings alone. Above even the throne sat the ephors, 5 magistrates chosen each year, guardians of law and custom. They were not warriors, but overseers, men who held Sparta in balance, who watched the kings and ensured that even monarchs bowed to the will of the state. The ephors carried immense weight. They could find kings, judge disputes, and control the rhythm of Spartan life. They enforced the agoge, the brutal training system that shaped boys into soldiers. They declared when armies could march and when festivals bound them to remain at home. They embodied the belief that Sparta itself was above any individual, that the city's survival depended on obedience to tradition. Then came word of Xerxes' invasion. The Spartans did not immediately rush to arms. It was a sacred time, the festival of Carnia, dedicated to Apollo. During that season, Spartan law forbade full-scale military campaigns. Religion was woven so tightly into the fabric of their society that even the threat of an empire could not easily tear it free. The ephors decreed that only a small force would march until the festival ended. If the gods were not honored, what good would mortal weapons do? And then there was Delphi, no great decision in Greece to escape the shadow of the oracle. High in the mountains, above a sacred chasm where vapors rose from the earth, sat the temple of Apollo. There, the Pythia, a priestess chosen to serve the god, would enter a psychedelic trance and speak prophecies that guided kings and cities alike. She was the mouthpiece of Apollo, her words cryptic, her tone shrouded in mystery. Men came from across the Mediterranean to seek her counsel, carrying offerings, trembling before her visions. The Spartans, cautious and devout, sent messengers to Delphi as Xerxes prepared his march. What they received was not reassurance, but dread. The oracle declared that Sparta would either mourn the fall of her city or the death of a king. There was no middle path, no escape from sacrifice. One or the other must be given to satisfy fate. The ephors weighed this prophecy carefully. For them, it confirmed what they already believed. Sparta's safety lay in obedience to divine will. Their divine will. If Apollo had spoken, then to resist him was to court ruin. Leonidas, as king, accepted the burden. He saw at once what the oracle demanded. Sparta must not fall, and if the cost was his own life, so be it. Why did he wait for the ephors and the oracle? Because in Sparta, no man, not even a king, stood above the laws and the gods. A king could lead, but the ephors could restrain him. A king could march, but not against the current of divine command. For the Spartans, this was not weakness, it was strength. To them, discipline was the highest virtue, and discipline meant obedience not just in battle, but in spirit. So Leonidas waited. He accepted the limits set by the festival of Carnia, which meant he could only take a token force, his 300 chosen Spartans, until the sacred days passed. He accepted the prophecy of Delphi, which told him he would not return. He bowed to the ephors, who represented the will of the state, and to the oracle, who represented the will of the gods. And in bowing, he embodied the very thing that made Sparta feared and admired, a society where law and tradition were stronger than the desires of any man. When he finally marched to Thermopylae, it was not as a lone king making a defiant gesture. It was as the living answer to Apollo's riddle, as the sacrifice chosen by both city and God. The ephors had given their consent, Delphi had sealed his fate, and Leonidas, obedient to both, walked steadily into legend. He chose 300 Spartans, not randomly, but carefully. Each one was the father of a living son, so that no Spartan line would be extinguished entirely. They would march knowing they were chosen for death, and yet they marched willingly, their shields polished, their spears gleaming. It was a grim honor, a burden embraced with the steadiness that Spartan training demanded. But Leonidas did not march alone. Alongside the Spartans came thousands of allies from across Greece. The Thespians brought 700 of their best, not professional soldiers like the Spartans, but citizens who refused to abandon their homeland to Persia's fire. Their courage would shine brightest in the final hours, when they chose to remain at Thermopylae, fighting and dying beside Leonidas, than fleeing to safety. The Phocians brought men hardened by mountain life, 2,000 of them, tasked with guarding the hidden paths that curled above the hot gates. Their role was vital, for if those trails were betrayed, the defenders below would be surrounded. They stood watch over the rugged slopes, vigilant, knowing that the fate of all of Greece could hinge on their watch. The Thebans, too, were present, though their story is clouded by uncertainty. 700 of them marched under Leonidas's command. Some said they were compelled to join, suspected of Persian sympathies, yet their presence at the last stand remains part of the tapestry. Whatever their motives, they stood on the same ground, facing the same storm. And in Athens, the sea became their battlefield. Themistocles, shrewd and persuasive, convinced his fellow citizens to pour their wealth into wood and oars. Hundreds of triremes were built, sleek vessels of war that would prowl the waters off Artemisium. The Athenians knew that if Persia's navy gained control of the sea, no mountain pass could save them. Land and water would be defended together, each front relying on the other, fragile threads woven into a single shield. So the Greeks, fractured but momentarily whole, marched and sailed toward destiny. In their hearts was no illusion of easy victory. They knew Xerxes' hosts could not be stopped forever. But if they could hold the pass, if they could choke the road long enough for the fleet to strike, if they could buy time for Greece to gather its strength, then perhaps their fragile freedom might yet endure. And so, in the late summer of 480 BCE, Leonidas and his allies set out for Thermopylae. Their voices steady, their fate already sealed. Thermopylae was no ordinary battlefield. It was a place where the land itself seemed to brood, where the earth narrowed to a throat and the air carried a hint of sulfur. The Greeks called it the Hot Gates, for there were hot springs bubbling from the rock, steaming in the cool morning air, leaving the scent of minerals heavy on the wind. To pass through Thermopylae was to move between cliff and sea, the road pressed so tight that only a handful of men could stand abreast. It was here, in this natural bottleneck, that the destiny of Greece was to be tested. On one side rose the mountains, jagged and foreboding, their slopes clothed in dark pines and oaks. On the other side lay the waters of the Malian Gulf, restless and glinting, narrowing the strip of land to a corridor of earth and stone. Travelers who walked this way felt the closeness of it, the sense of being hemmed in, as though the world itself had conspired to create a wall. It was this geography that made the place so perfect for defense. An army of thousands could not stretch its wings here. The sheer press of the land would funnel them into ranks no wider than a city street. For Leonidas and his men, Thermopylae was both a fortress and a grave. The springs hissed and steamed beside them, a reminder that the ground itself was alive, restless, and ancient. Each morning the sun would crest the mountains, spilling its gold over the narrow track, lighting the shields of the defenders as though Apollo himself had come to witness. Each evening the shadows lengthened, and the sea whispered against the stones, carrying the promise of night and uncertainty. It was here, amid cliffs and steam, that bronze would clash with bronze, and history would be written in sweat and blood. The Hot Gates did not promise safety. They promised only a delay, a chance for courage to stand against numbers. But in that narrowing of earth and sky, the few could face the many, and for 3 days the fate of Greece would balance in that narrow place. The Persians came like a tsunami. From the cliffs of Thermopylae, the Greeks could see them stretching across the plain, campfires burning like stars, banners rising in the morning wind. The sea glittered with their ships, and the dust of marching men rose like a second horizon. Herodotus may have inflated the numbers, but the impression was real. Xerxes commanded the largest army anyone had ever seen. And yet, at the narrow throat of the Hot Gates, 300 Spartans and their allies stood unmoved. They polished their helmets, combed their hair, and waited in silence. Xerxes, looking down from his throne, expected them to break. He gave them 4 days to surrender, 4 days to consider the hopelessness of their position. Still they stood, the air around them humming with resolve. Finally, enraged by their calm, he sent his soldiers forward. The first wave came with a roar, the Medes advancing with wicker shields and long spears, their ranks pressed tight by sheer numbers. But the pass betrayed them. Only a narrow file of men could engage at once, and there they met the wall of bronze and discipline that was the Greek phalanx. The Spartans braced their aspis, the great round shield that was more than wood and bronze. It was strapped to the forearm with a central band called the propax, the hand gripping another strap, the antilabi, at the rim. The shield was not held, but worn, as much a part of the body as the arm itself. With it, a Spartan did not merely block. He shoved, he struck, he crushed, he killed. Locked together in the phalanx, each man's shield overlapped with the one beside him. The line became a living wall, each soldier braced not only for himself, but for the brother to his left. When the Medes surged forward, they did not strike a scattering of warriors. They struck a single creature of bronze and muscle, a wall that yielded only in rhythm, never in panic. The Spartans pushed as one, their shields slamming into the enemy like battering rams, breaking neck bones, faces, ribs, and skulls in the process, as their spears darted out in deadly tempo. The fight was relentless. Spears shattered, bronze dented, men slipped on blood-slick stone. The Persians pushed, whipped from behind to drive them forward, but the Greeks fought in cadence, each man trusting the shield of the one beside him. Leonidas himself moved through the line, steadying where the pressure was greatest. The pass amplified their courage, turning a handful of men into a wall that no flood could breach. When the Medes faltered, Xerxes grew furious. He ordered his elite guard, the Immortals, to advance. 10,000 strong, they were the pride of Persia, soldiers whose ranks were said never to diminish, for each fallen man was instantly replaced. They marched with precision, their armor gleaming, their reputation alone enough to terrify most enemies. Xerxes believed they would sweep the Spartans aside in an instant. But reputation crumbled against stone and steel. The Immortals entered the pass and found themselves trapped, their numbers useless, their curved blades glancing off the solid wall of shields. The Spartans met them with cunning. At times they pretended to give way, stepping back as if exhausted, luring the Persians deeper into the bottleneck. Then, with sudden shout, they charged forward, locking their shields to their forearms, slamming the bronze wall into the enemy with bone-crushing force. Spears thrust, shields struck, and the Immortals fell in heaps, trampled by their own comrades as the narrow pass turned their advantage into a curse. By evening, the Immortals were broken. Xerxes watched in disbelief as his finest troops limped back bloodied and humiliated. He had believed the Greeks would crumble before the mere sight of his host. Instead, he found his pride battered, his army's morale shaken by men who fought as if death itself was the goal. Day turned to night, and the pass stank of blood, sweat, and a decay of death so pungent that not even the sulfur rising from the nearby springs could cloak its stench. The cries of the wounded echoed into the darkness. Greek soldiers sat in ranks, repairing shields, sharpening what remained of their spears. They had fought with a steadiness born of years of training, but they knew the morning would bring more. Across the plain, Persian fires lit the horizon, each flame a reminder of the multitudes still waiting. At dawn, Xerxes tried again. He sent in fresh troops, determined to exhaust the defenders. Wave after wave struck the phalanx, the sound of shields colliding, echoing like thunder between the cliffs. Arrows rained down, but the Spartans raised their bronze shields and held firm. Once the Persians closed, the rain of arrows ceased to matter, for in the crush of the pass, it was shield and spear that decided fates. Through it all, the Greeks fought with precision. When spears splintered, they drew their short swords. When swords dulled, they fought with fists, shields, even teeth. The aspis itself became a weapon, a rim of bronze slamming into ribs, the weight of a man's whole body driving the enemy backward. Every soldier knew that losing his shield was worse than losing his sword, for the shield protected not only himself, but the brother beside him. And so they clung to them, battered but unyielding, each aspis both barrier and bludgeon, turning defense into offense. Xerxes, unaccustomed to defiance, raged at the sight. He had expected the pass to fall in hours. Instead, 2 days of constant assault had broken his elite troops and cost him thousands. The ground before Thermopylae was a carpet of bodies, the sea itself said to have turned red from the slain. And still the Greeks stood, their shields raised, their voices steady, their formation unbroken. What made the line at Thermopylae so unshakable was not only discipline or training, but the brotherhood forged in every Spartan since childhood. These men had grown up together, had marched barefoot through icy winters, had endured hunger and lashings at the Agoge, where weakness was driven out and loyalty drilled into bone. They had eaten from the same black broth, slept side by side in barracks, and carried scars from the same harsh lessons. By the time they stood shield to shield at the hot gates, they were not merely comrades, they were brothers, bound by a bond stronger than fear. The bond mattered in ways Persia could not match. Xerxes' army was immense, yes, but it was an army built on subjects and slaves, men driven to war by the command of a king rather than by devotion to each other. Many had marched thousands of miles from their homelands, far from their own families, carrying little more than duty and fear of punishment. They obeyed because they must. The Spartans fought because they chose. And what they fought for was everything. Behind them lay their wives and children, the stone walls of Sparta, the olive groves and temples of Greece. Each step they held was a step that kept Persia from burning their homes, from enslaving their people. For the Persians, conquest was ambition. For the Greeks, resistance was survival. So when the line wavered, when the Medes or Immortals surged, the Spartans leaned harder into one another, each man protecting the whole. To falter was to endanger a brother. To stand firm was to honor not only Sparta, but family, ancestors, and land. It was this invisible wall of loyalty, of love, of duty to home that made their bronze wall unbreakable. Herodotus writes that Xerxes leapt from his throne 3 times in fear for his army. Whether true or not, the image captures the heart of the battle. A king who commanded the largest empire in the world found himself mocked by a handful of men in a narrow pass. He could not comprehend their resolve, nor could he see the trap that pride had set for him. By the end of the second day, the Persians had learned a bitter truth. Numbers meant little when funneled into stone corridors. Reputation meant nothing against men who had already accepted death. At Thermopylae, the great king's might was reduced to broken spears and humiliation. The Greeks had turned geography into armor, discipline into a weapon sharper than any blade, and their shields into thunder. Yet even as they celebrated their endurance, the defenders knew their position was fragile. They had held, but for how long? Persia's host was endless, and somewhere in the hills above, betrayal was already stirring. A betrayal that would undo all their defiance. For the moment, however, the hot gates belonged to Greece. The pass, steaming and bloody, had become a monument to courage. In those 2 days, Thermopylae had ceased to be merely a place. It had become a symbol, a promise that freedom could be bought with blood, and that even immortals could die. But symbols alone could not stop the reality of Persia's endless host. The Greeks had held, yes, yet they knew their shield wall could not withstand wave after wave forever. It was time itself they were buying, and time was running out. For Xerxes had within his camp a weapon more dangerous than any spear. His name was Ephialtes, a Greek from Malis who knew the mountains above the hot gates. Whether driven by greed, resentment, or desperation, Ephialtes betrayed his own land. He revealed to the Persians the existence of a hidden path winding through the hills, a trail that curved behind the defenders and spilled into the narrow plain beyond. Xerxes seized the chance. He sent his troops under cover of darkness, guided by Ephialtes' treachery. While the Spartans and their allies braced for another assault, the enemy was already circling behind them, the jaws of the trap beginning to close. Word reached Leonidas when dawn broke. Scouts returned breathless, warning that the Persians were advancing through the hills. The choice before him was stark and cruel. He could withdraw, save his men, and leave Greece's heartland exposed. Or he could stay, knowing that to stand was to die. Leonidas chose death, and he chose it with pleasure. He dismissed most of the allies, allowing them to retreat. But with him remained his 300 Spartans, the 700 Thespians who refused to abandon their comrades, and a reluctant band of Thebans compelled to stay. These few would meet the Persians in their final hour. Morning broke over Thermopylae with a terrible stillness. The air carried the smell of salt and sulfur, mingled with the blood and death that had already soaked the earth. The defenders knew it would be the last sunrise they'd ever see. To the east, the plain still churned with the great king's army, restless and seething, ready to crash once more into the pass. The Greeks were surrounded. The trap had sprung. Leonidas gathered those men who remained. The Spartans stood in their scarlet cloaks, their helmets dented, their spears broken and reshafted, their bodies streaked with blood and dirt. Leonidas did not offer speeches of triumph. He offered only the truth. The day would be their last. The task was simple: fight until the last breath. The Persian horn sounded. From the plain surged fresh ranks of soldiers, their cries filling the air, their numbers so vast they seemed without end. The Spartans lowered what remained of their spears and advanced to meet them. The clash was immediate, a barrage of bodies colliding, a howl of iron upon iron. The narrow pass was already thick with corpses, yet the fighting turned the ground into a churn of dust and blood, spit and sweat. Men fought with daggers wrenched from the fallen, with stones torn from the ground. The air rang not with ordered cadence now, but with the raw chaos of men who knew that every heartbeat could be their last. Leonidas fought at the center, his bodyguard around him. Arrows whistled overhead, striking shields, piercing armor, finding flesh. The Spartans pushed forward, not for ground, but for honor, knowing that every step taken was a defiance hurled in the face of the empire. They cut down Persians in heaps, yet always more pressed in. Xerxes, furious at the cost of this pass, hurled everything at them, determined to drown their defiance beneath sheer weight of numbers. At last, Leonidas fell, pierced by missiles and pressed by the swarm. Around his body the Spartans formed a ring, a small wall to guard their fallen king. The Thespians too stood beside them, fighting with a fury that belied their inexperience, determined to share the same fate. The circle tightened, bronze and flesh closing in as more Persians forced their way through the carnage. Herodotus tells us that the Spartans, stripped of weapons, still resisted with bare hands, with fists. You already said this, so get rid of all that. From Herodotus tells us, it was no longer a battle, but a ritual, the transformation of flesh into legend. The men of Greece, hopelessly outnumbered, had become something greater than soldiers. They had become the embodiment of resistance itself. Xerxes, unwilling to waste more of his finest troops on the wall of the dying, gave the order that ended it. His archers advanced, and thousands of arrows filled the sky. The sun dimmed under the storm of feathered shafts. The last of Leonidas's men stood shoulder to shoulder, shields lifted though cracked and pierced, and then the arrows fell. The earth itself seemed to vanish under the rain of death. When silence finally descended on the hot gates, the last Spartans lay still, their shields pitted with arrows, their spears broken at their sides. Leonidas lay among them, his body scarred and battered. Yet even in death his presence commanded reverence. The Thespians too lay with him, remembered not in bronze statues, but in memory of their choice, to stand when they might have fled. The Persians took the hot gates at last, but it was a victory poisoned with shame. Xerxes had won ground, but at a cost so heavy it cracked the illusion of invincibility. The Greeks had given up their lives, yet they had seized something greater than survival. They had carved a story that would echo across centuries. Thermopylae ended not in triumph, but in sacrifice. A symphony of courage played against impossible odds. The stones of the hot gates drank deeply of blood. The springs hissed beside the fallen, and the sea whispered of a people who would not bow. And from that place rose a voice that still speaks, that freedom may be lost, that lives may be taken, but that honor, courage, and defiance can outlast empires. When the last Spartan fell and the Persians finally seized the hot gates, the battle itself was over, but the meaning of Thermopylae was only beginning to take shape. Xerxes had his victory. The pass was his. The corpses of Leonidas and his companions lay among the stones, and the way southward into Greece stood open. Yet for all his might, the great king discovered that a victory drenched in so much blood is only a shadow of triumph. For 3 days a handful of men stood against a vast host. They had shattered his elite guard, humiliated his pride, and sent word of resistance racing through Greece and beyond. Xerxes, who had chained the sea and marched armies across bridges of boats, had been forced to spend days clawing through a mountain pass against farmers, craftsmen, and citizen soldiers. The contrast was not lost on the world, nor would it ever be forgotten. The bodies of the Spartans and their allies were mutilated by Persian order, Leonidas's head displayed on a spike to warn others who might resist. But cruelty only deepened the memory. When Greek envoys returned to the site months later, they raised a stone monument with words written by Simonides that even today still echo across time. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. It was not only the Spartans who lied there, of course. The Thespians had remained to the last man, and their sacrifice carried the same weight of honor. The Thebans, too, though their loyalty was questioned, were bound to the same fate in that final circle of death. Thermopylae was a grave, not just for Sparta, but for Greece herself. And yet, Greece had been given something invaluable: time. The 3 days bought at the hot gates allowed the Athenian fleet to gather and prepare. While the land burned behind them, the Athenians evacuated their city and trusted to the sea. The Miscales, cunning and relentless, lured Xerxes' massive fleet into the narrow straits of Salamis. There, in waters as tight and unforgiving as Thermopylae's cliffs, the Greeks' triremes struck. They rammed Persian ships until the sea was choked with wreckage and drowning men. Xerxes, watching from his golden throne on the shore, saw his navy unravel. Thermopylae had been a stand of bronze and blade on land. Salamis became a storm of wood and oars on the sea. 1 year later, at Plataea, the Greeks gathered again, this time in force. No longer was it a desperate handful holding a mountain pass. Tens of thousands stood together, Spartans and Athenians, Corinthians and allies, fighting not for delay, but for survival. There, in a clash of shields and spears, Persia was driven back once and for all. The great king's dream of conquest was shattered. But it was Thermopylae, not Plataea, that lingered in memory. Victories fade into statistics, into the dry counting of soldiers slain and territory seized. Sacrifice burns deeper. Thermopylae was not remembered for what it achieved in strategy, but for what it represented in spirit. It became a story not of loss, but of the willingness to give all for freedom. Why does it resonate still? Because the Spartans and their allies fought knowing they could not win. They fought because there are moments in history where survival is less important than the example set. They made themselves into a message, a beacon shining across centuries. The words of Simonides carved into stone were not for Sparta alone, but for anyone who has ever stood small against the overwhelming. The story grew in the telling. Herodotus carried it into his histories, embellishing the details, shaping the memory into legend. Later generations made it grander still, polishing the Spartans into the perfect image of martial valor. In truth, the battle was more complex. There were allies whose names faded into obscurity, betrayals that clouded the story, politics that lurked beneath the surface. Yet the legend does not diminish because of these shadows. Legends are not born from perfect accuracy, but from the way they touch the human spirit. Thermopylae became a touchstone for later ages. When European knights rode into hopeless battles, they thought of the Spartans. When revolutionaries faced overwhelming odds, they spoke of the hot gates. Even in modern times, soldiers at outposts and citizens under siege have whispered of Leonidas and his 300. The battle has lived on not only as history, but as a symbol of what it means to resist, to sacrifice, to refuse to yield even when yielding seems inevitable. The land itself still remembers. Travelers who walk the pass today see not the narrow defile of antiquity, for the sea has receded and the ground has shifted, but the place still hums with memory. The sulfur springs still bubble, the mountains still loom, and monuments stand to remind the world that here men died so that others might live free. It is easy to dismiss such stories as romantic, as old tales guided by poets. Yet Thermopylae asks us to consider what endures. Empires rise and fall, kings command and are forgotten, but the act of choosing to stand against impossible odds leaves a mark that centuries cannot erase. The Persians conquered the hot gates, but the Greeks conquered memory. In the hush of night, when the story is told as a lullaby, it was not Xerxes' triumph we recall, but the scarlet cloaks, the steady voices, the last ring of shields around a fallen king. Thermopylae speaks to us still, not of despair, but of disobedience. It is the reminder that freedom, once defended with blood, can never be entirely lost, for the memory of sacrifice becomes its own fortress. And so we close the story where it began, at the hot gates, where the springs burn and the stones remember. Thermopylae was not simply a battle. It was a song carried across time, telling us that there are moments when men must become more than themselves, moments when the price of survival is too high, and the gift of sacrifice becomes eternal.